The Drakken Harbingers are a loyalist Space Marine chapter established during the Second Founding. The founders of the Drakken Harbingers were salamander survivors of the drop site massacre of Isstvan V. The entirety of the Imperium was overflowing with hatred towards the traitors, but the ones who arguably felt it most were the survivors of Isstvan V. When they were taken back to Terra shortly after its siege was broken, these survivors found the remaining forces trying to find a way to deal with the Black Rage that was now rather rapidly taking over many of the Blood Angels after the death of their Primarch Sanguinius. Mechanicus operatives had begun examining the Angel's son's gene seed in a vain attempt to fix the issue. Some amongst them theorized that this taint could possibly be purified by exposing it to the fire of Vulcan that ran in the blood of his sons. Due to being the only ones currently on the scene, several of the salamanders who had survived the drop site massacre volunteered for an experiment that could test the theory, driven by the shame they had felt for not being able to help their brothers, the Imperium at large, and the Emperor during the heresy in a better way. The thought that if they could help the Battle Brothers be cured, that could, to a small degree, atone for their self-assumed sins. The experiment consisted of the volunteers having the Blood Angel's gene seed being implanted into them, with the hope that it being purified of the Black Rage. The results were successful to an extent. The salamanders experienced a brief loss of control, accidentally killing some of the people present before gaining control of themselves. The two gene seeds within their bodies had intertwined, creating a completely new strain. The mixture of the two had an extreme reaction with the chemicals in the minds of the volunteers, produced from the hate they experienced for the brothers that betrayed them, chaos which had corrupted said brothers, and themselves not being able to do close to anything to prevent the disaster that followed, creating a new state, which, at present, is known within the chapter as the Abyssal Hate. During this state, the Marine's emotions are overwhelmed by a single feeling of hatred, but directed at a specific target, primarily the thing which made the individual Marine experience the most anger. But unlike the Black Rage, this was not a mindless fit of anger, but a concentrated and focused stream of desire for the destruction of the individual's personal object of contempt. In the later years, it was discovered that this state made the Astartes of the chapter unusually resilient to the energies of the warp, and almost completely immune to mental manipulation. Considering that what brought out their worst were the taints of the Chaos and its followers, the volunteers decreed that they would go on a crusade to annihilate them. This genetic difference and change in mindset was what singled out these particular salamanders as the core of a new chapter when the division of the legions commenced. Despite the introduction of the Blood Angel's gene seed, the Drakken Harbingers hold the salamanders as their parent legion. They still honour and respect the salamanders despite having very different ideologies. To them, the salamanders' ways are far too pacifistic. The notion that Vulcan's fire that burns within their blood is a kindle for mankind to gather around, which will hold the darkness of the galaxy at bay, seems borderline disgraceful to the Drakken Harbingers. In their philosophy, it is a roaring hatred that needs to seek out and purify any and all who would dare try to darken the lives of man. That and their drive to constantly seek out massive gatherings of enemies are the result of the Abyssal Hate. Despite having some instabilities, the Drakken's gene seed is considered to be relatively pure, slightly more so than that of the Blood Angels, since none of the chapter's Astartes have ever shown any signs of the Red Thirst, and only very few have fully succumbed to the Black Rage, but those cases were amongst newly initiated aspirants who, in the words of the chapter masters, lacked the will to take control of the Emperor's gift, and instead lost themselves to it. Other than the Abyssal Hate, the only abnormalities in the gene seed have been displayed so far on their skin, becoming a dark grey colour, and their librarians developing latent pyromania. A theory of the Mechanicus elements that serve under the chapter for the surprising purity of their gene seed is the fact that the Astartes numbers are replaced at a very quick pace. The near constant filtering of troops does not give enough time to any mutations or any other defects to develop. The only time that the chapter has had a full roster of 1,000 Astartes was during its conception, but in the following millennia they have often come close, but have never managed to fully replenish their numbers again. Even though they complied to most of the regulations of the Codex Astartes, the Drakken Harbingers follow their own set of guidelines when it comes to the internal workings of the chapter. They share a piece of the Salamander's doctrine, where each of the Battle Brothers is taught to maintain his own war gear and the art of blacksmithing, along with the chapter's philosophy and combat training to make every single Astartes of the chapter more individualistic. Because their numbers are often quite low, the chapter puts a heavy focus on several types of hand-to-hand combat to ensure the safety of each Marine as much as possible, even in the worst case scenario where ammunition is depleted or war gear is sabotaged or malfunctioning. This specific focus has led to Power Fists gaining a wide preference among the majority of the chapter. In addition, the chapter itself is not split into companies. Instead, the whole of its standing forces move together, both through the empty void and on the battlefield as a single bulwark. That way, all of the Battle Brothers, regardless of veterancy, get to know each other very well, turning their individuality into an asset should the need for their forces to split up arise. Since commanding the veterans of the chapter can only assemble squads from amongst the Marines present around them with optimised efficiency based on the selected Battle Brothers characters in a short amount of time. The chapter itself is mostly self-sufficient, since food is grown in specific sections of the Veganza, and combat equipment is produced by Mechanicus elements that hold permanent residence above the fortress monastery. But they often visit planets for raw materials and other supplies. In combat, they exert ground-based operations, while their ship-to-ship prowess is not as expansive, mainly due to the fact that their doctrine gives a preference for more open battlefields. And because they are not as specialised in boarding actions as much other chapters, void combat is mainly left to various vessels under their command. They utilise a great amount of artillery with a wide impact along with a great number of devastators. A summary of their fighting doctrine would be grinding combat. The main bulk of the chapter firmly plants itself against the enemy, keeps them in place and slowly attempts to push them back, while their devastators and artillery along with any other friendly firepower bombard the enemy from the rear. In addition, almost every single battle brother carries various types of grenades on their person. The most favoured tactic is deploying as many artillery and devastators as possible in secure lines of an impending collision of enemy hordes, and the defences of Imperial troops, and then deploying the rest of the chapter via drop pods directly in the middle of the collision, preference being given to the very first rows of the enemy wave in order to crush them with the landing, creating a wall which holds the enemy tied and begins to march against it, grinding their numbers while receiving report from their rear. As a final measure, the armour of every single Astartes from the chapter is linked to monitor their life signs. As soon as the Marine dies, the power supply of the armour self-destructs and explodes along with any other explosives on the Marine's person, taking out whatever killed him and anything around them, giving the Drakken the opportunity to end more of the Emperor's enemies even when his life has become void.